Are there different standards for different people? All right, Deuteronomy 14:21. You shall not eat anything that dies of itself. You may give it to the alien who is within your gates, that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. Now, this is a hard one for a lot of people who first come to Messianic Judaism. They're like, oh my gosh, it's one law for the native-born and the foreigner. We're all supposed to keep the Torah. Yes, true. The way I like to describe this phenomenon is, it raises an interesting question. How can you give this to the foreigner, the stranger, if you're not allowed to eat it, right? Well, going back to the start of this, start of verse chapter 4, you are the children of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves, nor shave the front of your head for the dead, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Cool. I have a silver goblet in my truck. At least I hope it's silver. It might just be silver plate. Still trying to figure that out, but I haven't bothered. If I were to pour enough wine in it to have a sip without getting terribly drunk, is that permissible, so long as it's clean wine that has not been offered to an idol or filtered through blood and gelatine? Right? Okay, cool, permissible. Am I permitted to do the same thing if that vessel used to be used in the temple? Any examples of anybody trying that in the scripture? There was a fellow who once took something that was dedicated as holy and used it for a common purpose. I can use a regular plate for regular things. I cannot go to the temple and grab one of the pans from the temple and say, I'm taking this home and I'm going to have my steak on it, because it's my souvenir, right? I can't do that. Why? Because it's been set apart as holy to him. Well, there are different states of people, right? There are people who are in covenant. There are people who are out of covenant. People who are in covenant, are they allowed to keep the Passover? In covenant. Are they allowed? Yes. Do they have to keep the Passover? Yes. Is there a consequence if they don't keep the Passover? Yes. You get cut off. What about people that are outside of covenant? Are they allowed to keep the Passover? No. They're not even allowed. Right? Well, what about the high priest? Are there any laws that apply to him that don't apply to everybody in Israel? Yes. Can't marry a widow. No widows. Well, what if that applied to every member of Israel? What would happen to the widows in our midst? That wouldn't actually be righteous if you applied that to every member of Israel. Now you have all these widows, like Shmuel takes a wife, right? The good old Shmuel. And he's, not really made the Almighty pleased, so the Almighty offs him. And she was only married for like 5 days.
Wow, that's terrible.
So now she's a widow, but because everybody's following the rules of the high priest, she has to be a widow forever now. That would not be cool, man. That would not be right to do to the righteous women in Israel, would it? Okay? Are there any other rules that don't apply to everybody? You mentioned some earlier. Gender specific. I am never going to give birth, so I don't have to do the things that are specifically related to that mitzvah. Yeah? There are some married women in our community, right? There are some unmarried women in our community. There are 2 unmarried young ladies over here. Yeah? So let's say they get a few years on them, and there's a nice young Torah-keeping guy who gets a sparkle in his eye, and he says, hey, would you like to go out on a date? If they were so inclined and their father gave permission and all that, would they technically be able to do that? Yeah, right? They could engage in that portion. What about any of the married women in the community? Would they be able to do that? No. And why? Because their husbands have sanctified them unto themselves. And because their husbands have sanctified them to themselves, there are special rules which apply to them, which do not apply to women who have not been sanctified to a husband. there are rules which apply to Israel, sanctified to her master, that do not apply to the nations. And one of these rules is not eating anything that has died of itself. Why? Because that's what the husband has said. That's what the master has said. It's not actually a problem if people who are outside of covenant do this thing. That's what his word says. But because we've been sanctified to him, and we are holy to him, we are forbidden. And it is important to bear in mind that we don't take an attitude with other people, oh, you're not doing things right. Well, really? If the high priest went around saying, you people who all married widows, I'm more righteous than you. No, you're righteous because you are a high priest and you are honoring those rules. Those men are righteous for marrying the widows. Why? Because they're taking care of the widow and the orphan. And each are operating within the state to which they exist and following God's laws for them in that state. And one of the traps that we can fall into as Messianics is to get a little bit like, those other people, they're not necessarily doing that right. We don't want to be necessarily the most Pharisaic in that regard, especially if the Torah, which we subscribe to, wouldn't necessarily agree with us, yeah? So different people, different states, and it's important to try and figure out what those are. Number one, so we honor them in our own lives, and number two, so we don't unduly put burdens on others that are not righteous. Yes?